Hello, my name is Nicholas Ferranda, and I'm the Director of Student Disability Services here at the New School. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my talk about student disability services and your rights and responsibilities relating to students with disabilities and the services that we provide at the New School. Faculty does have some responsibilities in providing academic accommodations to their students. We want faculty to understand that this is an area that is not in your wheelhouse. This is not your area of expertise. And we want to shift that burden from you having to decide what accommodations to provide and what is reasonable and what isn't reasonable. And we want you to refer those students who are asking for accommodations to us directly. We want to take that off your plate. We want students to follow the appropriate policies and procedures and the process, and so that in that way, the only thing that you have to worry about is when you are provided a letter from the student, you just have to worry about following those letters, and of course, reaching out to us if you have any other questions. When students provide you with academic adjustment notices or attendance and disability memos, we'd like you to offer the student the opportunity to meet with them so that you can talk about what issues they may have in terms of their learning experience or what concerns they may have in terms of your course. And so you can collaborate and find a way where you can best educate that student. As I said before, we want you to provide accommodations only to students who have given you a letter from SDS explaining what accommodations are approved. If a student says that they had accommodations in high school or they had accommodations in their previous institution, you can say, thank you, I appreciate that, but I need to follow the procedures that are set forth by Student Disability Services. And so please reach out to Nick over at SDS and they will take care of you. It's also very important to maintain the confidentiality regarding a student's disclosure of a disability. So when the student is providing you with a letter identifying themselves as a student with disability, it is not going to talk about what the disability is, and you are not legally allowed to ask what the disability is, and they are not legally required to tell you what the disability is. We also want you to avoid discussing the student's personal or disability related issues in front of the class or even to other professors that the student may have. Because as I'll explain later about the process relating to distribution of academic adjustment notices, the student has the choice of providing letters to various professors. So if the student chooses to provide you with a letter and identify his, her, or themselves to you, they may not be identifying themselves to another one of your colleagues. And so we want to honor that student's right. And so we ask you not to specifically refer to students with disabilities that you know of to other faculty members. If you have a question about this, of course, I encourage you to reach out to me so we can talk about it. If you have other accommodation related questions or you're concerned about the implementation of a certain accommodation, I also want you to reach out so that we can find a way where you feel comfortable in providing the needed accommodation. I'd like to talk about a scenario that impacts many faculty over the course of their time at the New School and other universities. And that relates to a student's ability to be present in all the classes and meet deadlines as required. There are a number of different kinds of disabilities that may impact the student in various ways that will likely prevent the student from making it to 100% of the classes or meeting all of the deadlines. Some of those disabilities might include previously mentioned ones such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, Crohn's disease, bipolar disorder, multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, or seizures. And each of these diagnoses may impact the student's ability to attend in a different way. So, for example, depression, a student might not be able to get out of bed. Anxiety might prevent a student from showing up to class if they're having a panic attack. Crohn's disease, a student might have ingested something that has triggered their gastrointestinal system to have a reaction. Multiple sclerosis, the student might have an exacerbation of their symptoms and they may have an attack. Fibromyalgia might be in too much pain to walk that day. Seizures, they might be in brain fog and not be able to really be present in that class. And so we have all these different reasons why a student might not be able to be present or might not be able to meet a deadline. And this is the reason why we have what's called an attendance and disability memo. And when we do talk about the attendance and disability memo, we obviously have to talk about what responsibilities the faculty have relating to these policies. And so what we need you to do as faculty is that you need to inform students of what the attendance policy is on the course syllabi. Any students who wish to discuss the attendance policy with you, we need you to meet and listen to what their concerns are. If they ask for some flexibility in relation to your attendance or deadline flexibility, and you are unable to extend or increase your flexibility, you need to talk about why you will not be able to do that and what your rationale is. And you have to articulate a legitimate pedagogical reason for why you are unable to do this. So we have some guidance in relating to determining whether attendance is an essential aspect of the course. And some of these questions are drawn directly from these OCR guidelines. And they include questions of whether there are classroom interactions between the instructor and students and amongst other students. To what degree do student contributions constitute a significant component of the learning process? So when you're in your class, how important is the back and forth amongst students to the fundamental requirements and the core competencies that you're looking to achieve? Does the fundamental nature of the course rely on the student participation as an essential method for learning? And to what degree does a student's failure to attend constitute a significant loss to the educational experience of the other students in the class? So if a student is not there, how much does their failure to contribute impact other students' abilities to meet the fundamental requirements and the core competencies of the class? Finally, what do you articulate in the course description and the syllabus? So when you're thinking about attendance and the official new school policy and comparing that with what your fundamental requirements are, if a student is able to meet the fundamental requirements and the core competencies of your class, but may need to miss an extra class or two as a result of the symptoms related to the disability, which are unpredictable, you need to ask yourself whether the student can still meet those requirements. Because there are a number of different questions relating to attendance and deadlines on a regular basis in my office, I feel like it's really important to drive down into how a professor makes a determination of what is reasonable and what is not reasonable in relation to the policy that they have. So other than the OCR questions, we also want you to be thinking about what is the attendance policy of the department that the faculty member is in. We want to convey the attendance policy both verbally and in writing to the students. We recommend that you mention that towards the beginning of the class, especially in the first class. If there are ways where a student may get partial attendance, include that information. If they're late a certain amount of times, they may lose some points, but they won't lose all the points. In your syllabi or in your talk, we want you to talk about why why a student's attendance in this class is important to the academic integrity of the class. Want to be open to discussing possible ways to make up work if it is considered an equal method of achieving the fundamental requirements of the course. We would like you to keep attendance logs for all students, not just certain students who may have presented you with a memo. And we really need you to be mindful of students who are missing classes and give them warnings before students begin to reach that critical maximum absence list. So when a student talks to you, if you're explaining to them that they can miss 5 classes instead of 2 or 3 classes, and they're getting up to class 3, we would strongly encourage you to reach out to that student and let them know that they have already exhausted 3 out of the 5 potential absences for the semester, and so that they know where they're at and they can make informed decisions about when they're using their absences, as opposed to waiting until after they've utilized all of their absence flexibility and letting them know that they can't take any more. And we want that because students' symptoms of their disabilities, when they have disabilities that necessitate this kind of accommodation, they're unpredictable. And so they're not exactly sure when their symptoms become so acute that they're not going to be able to make it to class, or they're not going to be able to hand in their work on time. So they need that advance notice to be able to properly plan. And of course, as always, if you have questions or you're concerned about a particular student, we want you to reach out to SDS so that we can hear your concerns. We might be able to reach out to the student. We can kind of get a sense of what's going on. If necessary, we can collaborate and convene a meeting with SDS and the student and the professor to talk about what the issues are, what the concerns are, and find some way to collaborate and move forward so that the student has the best chance for success. We previously discussed faculty responsibilities in terms of securing accommodations. We will now talk about the student responsibilities in the process. Students must identify themselves and register with Student Disability Services. Students must deliver their academic adjustment notice and/or their attendance and disability memo to professors. They don't have to discuss the specifics of their diagnosis with the professor, but they do need to provide the letter to the professor in order to be protected. The students need to remind the professor about any testing accommodations before an exam, ideally a week to 2 weeks ahead of time. And the student needs to reach out to Student Disability Services and request to utilize the testing center to utilize their accommodations. Students must fulfill all academic requirements and attendance mandates unless addressed in the attendance and disability memo. And if students are struggling and they're concerned about their ability to be successful, they are expected to communicate with that professor to find a way where they may be able to pick up their grade or absorb the information more effectively. Some important things to know, as I was previously talking about: just because a student receives certain kinds of services in high school, it does not mean that they're going to receive the same services in higher education. So there are some students in the K-12 arena that have one-to-one aides, where an instructional assistant will move with the student from class to class and provide them with an accommodation of keeping them on track, maybe taking notes or something like that. That is not going to happen at this level. Students do not have to use accommodations. They can choose to use one accommodation and not choose to use another. A student who has note-taking accommodations and also testing accommodations, if they don't need the extra time for your particular class, they can choose to just use the note takers. They're not required to use them. They don't want to. Accommodations can be requested at any point in the semester. So while ideally we want all of our students to identify themselves and request accommodations in the beginning of the semester, they're not required to do so. And sometimes it is simply the case that the symptoms of a disability may not make themselves known until the semester's already started. And so we may not meet with that student until halfway through the semester. And once we meet with that student and we receive the appropriate documentation, we can then approve the student for accommodations from that moment forward, and then they can request those accommodations from the professor at that point. However, it's important to understand that accommodations are not retroactive. So if we're talking about that student and they realize they're struggling and they take the midterm and they bomb the midterm, and then they come in and meet with Student Disability Services, and then they qualify for accommodations, they cannot then forward along their academic adjustment notice and request that the professor allow them to retake their midterm with the accommodations that they now receive. That is not a reasonable accommodation, and professors should not enable that. It is the same with attendance and disability memos. So the attendance and disability memo is meant to protect the student from that moment forward. The absences before the distribution of the letter can be treated as straight up absences. However, we ask you to be mindful of the circumstances and situation, as well as the process for processing accommodations. And again, as previously stated, standards of academic integrity are not going to be waived or lowered, and the fundamental requirements are not going to be altered. If you have questions about whether you think that these might be waived or lowered or altered as a result of an accommodation, I encourage you to reach out to Student Disability Services so that we can discuss that in more detail. And we may be able to find an equivalent accommodation that might be more reasonable to the professor.